Every prison has one man nobody notices. Not because he's dangerous. Not because he's weak. Because after enough years, people simply stop looking. At Blackstone State Prison, that man was known only as Old Ben. Nobody knew exactly how old he was. Some inmates said 65. Others swore he was pushing 75. The correctional officers stopped trying to guess years ago. He walked slowly. His gray beard covered most of his face. His prison uniform always looked 2 sizes too big. One shoulder leaned lower than the other from an old injury. Every afternoon, he sat on the same weathered bench overlooking the prison yard. A paperback book rested in his hands. Sometimes history. Sometimes philosophy. Sometimes boxing magazines that were years out of date. Most inmates assumed he was just another lonely old man waiting for time to pass. Nobody ever asked his story. Until Mike Tyson arrived. News traveled through prison faster than anywhere else in the world. Before Mike Tyson even stepped inside his housing unit, everyone already knew. The champ's here. I heard he's keeping to himself. They say nobody can look him in the eye. They say he still trains every morning. Rumors grew larger every hour. Most weren't true. Mike ignored all of them. He had learned long ago. People love stories more than facts. During his first week, Mike stayed away from unnecessary conversations. He worked out. Read books. Walked the yard. Kept his circle small. Some inmates took that as confidence. Others called it arrogance. Mike didn't care. Prison had one unwritten rule. Respect everyone. Trust almost no one. On Friday afternoon, the prison yard filled with hundreds of inmates. Some played basketball. Others lifted makeshift weights. Groups gathered around picnic tables discussing appeals. Football. Or life outside. Mike preferred walking laps around the fence. Movement cleared his mind. As he passed the old concrete benches, he noticed someone watching him. An elderly prisoner. Gray beard. Small smile. Holding a worn boxing magazine. The old man raised the magazine slightly. Mike nodded politely and kept walking. Nothing unusual. Or so he thought. 10 minutes later, Mike passed the same bench again. The old man was still reading. This time, he spoke without looking up. You still drop your right shoulder before the left hook. Mike stopped walking. Slowly turned. You talking to me? The old man finally looked up. His eyes were calm. Sharp. Much younger than the rest of his face. I've been talking to you. Mike frowned slightly. What did you say? The old man smiled. You still drop your right shoulder. You've done it since you were 19. Mike stood there silently. That wasn't information an ordinary fan would know. A few nearby inmates noticed Mike had stopped. One whispered. Old Ben actually spoke? Another laughed. He probably thinks he's training the heavyweight champion. Several inmates began watching. Mike walked closer. You follow boxing? The old man chuckled. I used to follow it. What do you mean? I knew it before most people watched it on television. Mike folded his arms. You've got a good memory. The old man nodded. It's one of the few things prison couldn't take. One younger inmate shouted across the yard. Hey Ben! You giving Tyson fighting lessons? The group burst into laughter. Old Ben didn't react. Neither did Mike. Mike looked at the magazine. It wasn't new. Its cover showed heavyweight champions from decades earlier. The edges were falling apart. You've kept that a long time. Old Ben gently brushed dust from the cover. 30 years. Mike raised an eyebrow. You serious? I don't throw away memories. Something about the old man's voice felt familiar. Not the sound. The confidence. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He spoke like someone who had already lived the stories others only talked about. Mike sat down on the opposite end of the bench. The surrounding inmates immediately noticed. Whispers spread across the yard. Tyson's actually sitting with him. Why? Nobody sits with old Ben. Mike pointed toward the magazine. Who's your favorite fighter? Old Ben smiled. I've got two answers. The fans' answer. And the trainer's answer. Mike leaned forward. Trainer? Old Ben realized what he'd said. He quietly laughed. Old habits. Mike noticed it immediately. You were a trainer? The old man stayed silent for several seconds. Then nodded. A lifetime ago. Who'd you train? The old man shrugged. Nobody you'd remember. Mike wasn't convinced. Real trainers never answered that way. Especially experienced ones. They usually named names. Old Ben didn't. He changed the subject. You've gotten calmer. Mike smiled. You can tell? The old man nodded. The younger Mike Tyson would have answered my first comment with a challenge. And today's Mike? You asked me a question. Mike laughed quietly. Fair enough. The afternoon sun drifted lower. Most inmates returned to basketball. Others kept glancing toward the bench. Nobody understood why Mike Tyson was spending time with the quiet old prisoner everyone ignored. Finally, Mike asked, How long have you been here? Old Ben looked toward the prison walls. So long? I stopped counting. You got family? I did. That was before I ever met Cuz. Old Ben nodded. Several years before. The afternoon breeze pushed dust across the prison yard. For the first time since arriving, Mike Tyson wasn't thinking about prison. His mind had traveled decades into the past. Back to Catskill. Back to the old gym. Back to the man who had changed his life forever. Mike carefully handed the photograph back. How did you know him? Old Ben looked at the picture for several moments. We weren't best friends. But we respected each other. I trained amateur fighters. Small gyms. Golden Gloves tournaments. Nothing glamorous. Cuz had already become a legend. Mike smiled. That sounds like him. Old Ben laughed. He scared people. Mike nodded. He also inspired them. There was one afternoon. Old Ben continued. When I drove 3 hours just to watch one of his training sessions. Mike listened without saying a word. Cuz never wasted words. He watched a young fighter miss the same punch 3 times. The kid apologized. Cuz looked at him and said, I'm not disappointed because you missed. I'm disappointed because you missed the exact same way. Mike smiled. I've heard him say things like that. Old Ben nodded. That sentence changed how I coached forever. Mike leaned back. So what happened? Old Ben's smile slowly faded. I made one mistake. What kind of mistake? The kind that changes the rest of your life. He looked across the yard. Not at the inmates. Not at the guards. Somewhere much farther away. I owned a small boxing club. We barely made enough money to stay open. But those kids. They believed in me. He paused. Then one night. I made a terrible decision. Mike quietly asked. What happened? I got involved with the wrong people. Debt. Easy money. I convinced myself I could fix everything before anyone got hurt. He lowered his eyes. I was wrong. I lost the gym. I lost my family. And eventually, I lost my freedom. The words came without excuses. Without blaming anyone else. Mike respected that. Most men in prison blamed the system. The judge. The police. Bad luck. Old Ben blamed only himself. Mike asked softly. Did Cuz know? Old Ben nodded. He visited me once. Mike looked surprised. He came to see you? Before sentencing. What did he say? Old Ben smiled through tired eyes. He didn't ask what I'd done. He asked who I planned to become. Mike felt a chill run through him. That sounded exactly like Cuz. Old Ben continued. I told him my life was over. He shook his head. Mike almost knew what was coming. What did he say? Old Ben looked directly at Mike. He said. The bell hasn't rung yet. Mike closed his eyes for a second. He could almost hear Cuz saying it. Several inmates nearby had quietly stopped playing cards. Even without hearing every word. They sensed this conversation mattered. The old man they had ignored for years was telling stories only someone close to boxing could know. Mike finally asked. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Old Ben shrugged. Would they have believed me? Mike looked around the yard. Probably not. Most inmates only saw an old man feeding birds and reading books. None of them saw the life he'd lived before prison. You know something? Old Ben said. Mike nodded. When I first heard you were coming here, I hoped you'd never speak to me. Mike frowned. Why? Because I was ashamed. Mike looked surprised. Ashamed of what? I knew the man who helped shape your future. But I wasted mine. Mike didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the weathered hands resting on the old notebook. Hands that had wrapped fighter's gloves. Held focus mitts. Written thousands of journal pages. Hands that had made mistakes. Just like his own. Finally Mike spoke. You know what I think? Old Ben smiled. I'm about to. I think you're judging yourself by your worst chapter. The old man's eyes lifted. Mike continued. If people judged me only by my mistakes, they wouldn't remember anything else. Old Ben quietly nodded. I suppose that's true. No. Mike smiled. It's certain. Just then, the loudspeaker echoed. All inmates prepare for afternoon count. Nobody moved. Not yet. Mike stood up. Then did something that surprised everyone watching. He held out his hand. Old Ben looked at it. Confused. What are you doing? Showing respect. You don't owe me that. Mike smiled. It isn't about owing. It's about earning. After a long pause, Old Ben slowly stood. His knees cracked with age. He reached out. The two men shook hands. Across the prison yard, every conversation stopped. Some inmates had never seen anyone shake Old Ben's hand. Others couldn't believe Mike Tyson was doing it. Carter, the tattooed inmate from the day before, watched from across the yard. One of his friends whispered. Who is that old guy? Carter slowly answered. I don't think we've been asking the right question. What do you mean? The question isn't who he was. It's who he still is. Over the following weeks, something changed. Not only for Mike. For the prison. Young inmates started sitting beside old Ben. At first, they asked about boxing. Then about life. Then about regret. The old bench that had spent years empty became the busiest place in the yard. Some called it a classroom. Others called it therapy without a therapist. Old Ben simply called it conversation. One afternoon, Mike arrived carrying a small package from the prison library. What VE you got? Old Ben asked. Mike handed it to him. Inside was a brand new journal. Leather cover. Blank pages. Old Ben smiled. My old one isn't full yet. I know. Mike said. But someday it will be. Old Ben ran his hand across the cover. You think I've still got more to write? Mike looked at him. The best stories usually come after people think they're over. Months later, a young inmate preparing for parole approached Mike. You know that old man? Mike smiled. I do. He changed my life. Mike nodded. Mine too. The inmate looked surprised. But you're Mike Tyson. Mike laughed. So? I thought champions already knew everything. Mike shook his head. The day you think you've got nothing left to learn is the day you stop growing. Years later, after both men had left prison, a journalist asked Mike during an interview, who gave you the best advice while you were incarcerated? The reporter expected the name of a famous coach, a celebrity, a psychologist. Instead, Mike smiled. An old prisoner nobody noticed. The interviewer looked confused. What did he teach you? Mike answered without hesitation. He reminded me that every person has a story. And if you judge someone by the chapter you meet them in, you'll never understand the whole book. Back at Blackstone State Prison, the old concrete bench remained exactly where it had always been. New inmates passed it every day. Most never knew why it mattered. But the men who had witnessed those conversations never forgot them. Because they had learned something rare inside prison walls. Sometimes the strongest man in the yard isn't the loudest, isn't the youngest, isn't even the most famous. Sometimes, he's simply the one who has learned from every mistake and is willing to help someone else avoid making the same one. And that was the story nobody believed until the old prisoner finally told it.